December 1975, Luanda, Angola. Cuban soldiers, thousands of them, were pouring into a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. Soviet transport planes landed every few hours, unloading artillery, tanks, and advisors. The Cold War superpowers were fighting a war in Africa.
And the United States was losing. Badly.
The CIA had spent millions arming anti-communist rebels. They'd recruited mercenaries, shipped weapons, and promised victory. And in a matter of weeks, their entire operation collapsed. The Cuban-Soviet coalition crushed the CIA-backed forces so decisively that America's allies literally fled into the jungle. Congress cut funding. The CIA retreated. Angola became a Soviet client state for the next 15 years. And here's the part they don't teach you in school.
Angola wasn't an exception. It was the rule.
We won the Cold War. That's what the history books say, right? The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. Democracy triumphed. But that's the story we tell ourselves in the West.
Because if you were in Angola in 1975, or Nicaragua in 1979, or Afghanistan before the Soviets invaded, you saw a very different Cold War. You saw the CIA lose, repeatedly, spectacularly.
Often to KGB-backed forces that were better organized, better funded, and willing to do things the Americans either couldn't or wouldn't. This is the story of a secret war. The shadow conflict fought in the jungles, mountains, and cities of the Third World, where coups were currency and human lives were collateral damage. And what was the final tally in this shadow war?
America lost more than it won. The KGB outplayed the CIA in Africa. Soviet tactics crushed American strategy in Central America. And when the scoreboard was finally tallied in the late 1980s, the Third World was littered with Soviet victories and American failures.
We like to remember Afghanistan, the one proxy war we eventually won. But what about all the others?
Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and a dozen other countries where the hammer and sickle flew over the capital because the CIA failed.
So what is this, really?
This is the war we lost. The one we don't talk about.
Until now. Let's establish the ground rules of Cold War proxy conflicts, because this wasn't conventional warfare. By the 1960s, both superpowers understood that direct military confrontation meant nuclear annihilation. Moscow and Washington would never fight each other openly. Too dangerous, too final. But they still needed to fight. The ideological struggle, capitalism versus communism, demanded it. So they developed a new model. Rule 1, never fight directly. Always use proxies. The CIA and KGB didn't send American or Soviet soldiers into combat, at least not officially. They armed local factions, funded rebel movements, and turned civil wars into superpower showdowns. Rule 2, deny everything. When Cuban troops invaded Angola, Moscow claimed they were volunteers. When the CIA armed Contras in Nicaragua, Washington insisted they were freedom fighters, acting independently. Plausible deniability was the name of the game?
Plausible deniability was the only game. Nobody believed the lies, but nobody could prove them either. That was the point.
Rule 3. The Third World is the battlefield. Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, these weren't peripheral conflicts. They were the main event. Whoever controlled the developing world controlled the future, or so both sides believed.
Or so both sides told themselves. The truth? The Third World was expendable. Test sites for weapons, training grounds for tactics. And if millions died, well, they weren't American or Russian, so who's counting?
Rule 4. There are no rules?
There are no rules. Assassinations, coups, torture, mass civilian casualties. Everything was permitted as long as it advanced your side's interests. The Geneva Conventions? Irrelevant when you're funding death squads or mining harbors.
Now, with those rules established, let's talk about how this shadow war actually played out. Starting with the continent where American strategy fell apart completely.
Africa, where the CIA lost, repeatedly, decisively, and often humiliatingly.
Let's start with America's most humiliating third world defeat, Angola. Portugal had controlled Angola as a colony for 400 years. In 1974, a revolution in Portugal led to rapid decolonization. Suddenly, Angola was independent, and three rival factions immediately went to war for control. The MPLA, People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, Marxist, Soviet-backed, controlled the capital Luanda. Then there were UNITA and FNLA, anti-communist rebels, the CIA's chosen proxies. This should have been easy for America, right? The Cold War playbook was simple. Fund the anti-communists, let them win, install a friendly government. Worked in Iran in 1953, worked in Guatemala in 1954.
Except Angola wasn't Iran, and the Soviets weren't playing by the old rules.
Moscow sent weapons, lots of them. Then they sent something unprecedented, Cuban combat troops, not advisors, actual battalions. Thousands of Cuban soldiers with Soviet training, Soviet tanks and Soviet air support. The CIA, meanwhile, sent money and guns to FNLA and UNITA. They recruited South African mercenaries.
Yes, apartheid South Africa. Great look CIA. Really winning hearts and minds with that alliance.
They promised American backing, and those promises were...
lies. The promises were lies.
When the Cuban MPLA forces launched their offensive in late 1975, the CIA-backed rebels collapsed within weeks. The South African mercenaries fled. The FNLA disintegrated. UNITA retreated into the countryside to fight a guerrilla war that would last another 15 years and kill over 500,000 people. And here's the kicker. Congress found out about the operation and was furious. In December 1975, they passed the Clark Amendment, explicitly banning further CIA involvement in Angola. So the CIA lost Angola. And then?
Congress banned them from even trying to win it back. Final score, MPLA victory. Soviet client state established. Cuban troops remained in Angola until 1991. The CIA's grand African strategy, dead on arrival.
But surely Angola was an isolated failure. An outlier?
Oh, it gets worse.
Mozambique, 1975. Portugal also abandoned Mozambique. The Soviet-backed group Frelimo took power. The CIA-backed resistance movement, Renamo, what happened to them?
Devolved into a terrorist organization that murdered civilians and destabilized the country for decades. Soviet victory.
Ethiopia, 1977. A Marxist military junta called the Derg overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie. The Soviets armed them. The CIA backed Somali forces in the Ogaden War. And Somalia?
Lost. The Derg remained in power for 14 years. Soviet victory.
Zimbabwe, 1980. The CIA backed anti-communist forces during the Rhodesian Bush War. Robert Mugabe, Soviet-aligned, won the election and...
ruled for 37 years. Soviet victory. Do you see the pattern yet?
In Africa, during the 1970s, the KGB won. Repeatedly, decisively. Soviet-backed movements took power in Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe. Marxist governments controlled a third of the continent. And the CIA? What did they have to show for it?
Failed operations, dead proxies, congressional investigations. That's it. That's the list.
So why? Why did the Soviets win in Africa when the CIA had more money, more resources, more experience? What was the difference?
Simple. They were willing to commit. Troops, weapons, long-term support. The Cuban deployment to Angola wasn't a one-time thing. Cuban forces stayed for 15 years. 15 years. The CIA operated on yearly budgets, subject to congressional approval. Support could evaporate overnight if American public opinion shifted or if a scandal broke.
So the proxies knew.
They knew the Soviets were reliable and the Americans were fickle.
Moscow saw Africa as
A long-term investment. Washington saw it as a sideshow.
So when you look at the strategies, Soviet commitment versus American indifference, which one worked?
Guess.
If Africa was bad for the CIA, Central America was a moral and strategic disaster. Let's talk about Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. 3 countries where the CIA fought Soviet-backed movements and left behind nothing but corpses and regimes even worse than what they replaced. Nicaragua, 1979. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, a Marxist guerrilla movement, overthrew dictator Anastasio Somoza. The Sandinistas were Soviet-aligned, Cuban-trained, and suddenly controlled a country 1,200 miles from Texas. So Washington panicked, right?
Panicked is an understatement. They lost their minds.
The CIA organized the Contras, a counter-revolutionary force of former Somoza loyalists, disillusioned Sandinistas, and recruited peasants. The Reagan administration poured money, weapons, and training into the Contras, with one goal: overthrow the Sandinistas. And it worked, didn't it?
It failed.
For an entire decade, 1981 to 1990, the Contras fought. They conducted raids, sabotaged infrastructure, and committed well-documented atrocities. Human Rights Watch recorded Contra forces systematically murdering civilians, burning villages, and using terror tactics against anyone suspected of supporting the Sandinistas. The CIA didn't just fund this, they enabled it. They mined Nicaraguan harbors, an illegal act under international law. They wrote training manuals teaching assassination and psychological warfare. They lied to Congress about the scale of operations. When Congress discovered the deception, they cut funding via the Boland Amendment. So the Reagan administration did something breathtaking in its illegality.
They secretly sold weapons to Iran and funneled the profits to the Contras. Iran-Contra, one of the biggest political scandals in American history.
And after all that, after a decade of war, tens of thousands dead, the country devastated, surely the Contras won?
No. The Sandinistas remained in power until 1990. When they lost a democratic election, they didn't fall to the Contras. They lost at the ballot box. 10 years, billions of dollars, countless lives, for nothing.
While Nicaragua burned, El Salvador descended into civil war. The CIA backed the Salvadoran government, a right-wing military dictatorship, against the FMLN, a Marxist guerrilla force backed by Cuba and Nicaragua. Here's where it gets ugly.
Here's where it gets uglier. The Salvadoran military and its allied death squads murdered over 75,000 civilians during the war. They targeted priests, teachers, union organizers, and anyone suspected of leftist sympathies.
In 1980, death squads assassinated Archbishop Oscar Romero while he was celebrating Mass. A month later, they raped and murdered 4 American nuns. The CIA knew. They had reports detailing the atrocities. But they kept funding the Salvadoran military anyway because
the alternative, an FMLN victory, was unacceptable.
The war ended in 1992 with a negotiated peace. The FMLN became a legal political party. They eventually won the presidency in
2009, 75,000 dead, 12 years of war. And the communists eventually took power anyway through elections.
And then there's Guatemala, where the CIA's actions were so horrific that decades later they're still classified. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup against democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz because he redistributed land from the United Fruit Company. They installed a military dictatorship. For the next 40 years, a series of military regimes, armed, trained, and funded by the CIA, waged a genocidal campaign against indigenous Mayan populations suspected of supporting leftist rebels. The UN Truth Commission would later determine that Guatemalan forces committed acts of genocide. Over 200,000 civilians were killed. The majority were indigenous Mayans. Entire villages were massacred. Who led these operations?
CIA-trained officers led these operations. CIA provided intelligence, identified targets. And when evidence of the genocide emerged, the CIA helped cover it up.
So let's tally the final score in Central America.
Nicaragua, 10-year war. Sandinistas stayed in power. Tens of thousands dead. Iran-Contra scandal. El Salvador, 12-year war. 75,000 dead. FMLN eventually won democratically. Guatemala, 40 years of dictatorship, genocide, 200,000 dead. And the Soviet-backed movements, they either stayed in power or eventually won through elections.
So this was victory for American interests?
This wasn't victory, it was failure with a body count.
So why? Why did the CIA lose the Third World Shadow War? What did the Soviets understand that we didn't?
Let's be brutally honest. The Soviets were better at it.
Reason 1. Commitment. When Moscow backed a movement, they stayed. Decades of support, weapons, training, advisors, troops if necessary. The Cuban deployment to Angola wasn't a one-time thing. Cuban forces stayed for how long?
15 years. The CIA, they operated on yearly budgets subject to congressional approval. Support could evaporate overnight if American public opinion shifted, or if a scandal broke. Proxies knew the Soviets were reliable, and the Americans were fickle.
Reason 2. Ideology. Say what you want about Soviet communism, but it offered something to Third World liberation movements. A coherent ideology of anti-imperialism and economic justice. What did the CIA offer?
We're not communists, that's it. That's the rallying cry. American-backed forces often defended corrupt dictators, foreign business interests, and existing power structures. The Soviets backed movements fighting colonialism and inequality. The CIA backed whoever opposed the Soviets, regardless of how brutal or unpopular they were.
Reason 3. Brutality. The KGB and their proxies were willing to do whatever it took. Torture, assassinations, mass executions, scorched earth. But the CIA did these things too, didn't they?
They did, but they had to hide it. Congressional oversight, media scrutiny, and American democratic norms created constraints that the Soviets simply didn't have. Moscow could send 50,000 Cuban troops to Angola without asking anyone's permission. Washington couldn't even get congressional approval for covert funding, half the time.
And reason 4, the one that really stings?
The local populations often preferred the Soviets. In many Third World countries, Soviet-backed movements had genuine popular support. They were fighting against colonialism, dictatorships, and foreign exploitation. The MPLA in Angola, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the FMLN in El Salvador. These weren't just Soviet puppets. They were nationalist movements that aligned with Moscow because Moscow offered support.
And the CIA-backed forces represented?
The old elite, foreign interests, outright dictatorships. When given a choice between Soviet-backed revolutionaries promising land reform and American-backed reactionaries defending the status quo, many Third World populations chose the Soviets. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough that it mattered.
Now, to be fair, the CIA didn't lose every proxy war. There's one massive exception we have to acknowledge, right?
Afghanistan.
When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the CIA launched Operation Cyclone, the largest covert operation in American history. Billions of dollars in weapons, training, and support flowed to the Mujahideen resistance. And it worked. The Soviets were bled dry in the mountains of Afghanistan. By 1989, they withdrew in defeat. The Soviet-backed government in Kabul collapsed in 1992. CIA victory, Soviet defeat. The war that helped bring down the USSR. So we won Afghanistan cleanly.
Except, the Mujahideen we armed included a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. The weapons we provided ended up in the hands of the Taliban. The instability we helped create led directly to 9/11s and 20 years of American war in Afghanistan. We won the battle. We lost the war. And we're still paying the price.
So what's the final score in the Third World proxy wars?
Soviet victories. Angola, MPLA in power, 1975%. Mozambique, Frelimo, 1975%. Ethiopia, Derg, 1974 to 1991. Zimbabwe, Mugabe, 1980 to 2017. Nicaragua, Sandinistas, 1979 to 1990. Then returned to power, 2006 to present. American victories, Afghanistan, where the Mujahideen defeated Soviets, then created the Taliban.
The list is lopsided, and the victories came with consequences we didn't anticipate. But what's really haunting about the Third World Shadow War isn't the strategic failures, is it?
It's the human cost. Angola's civil war, 500,000 dead. Mozambique's civil war, 1 million dead. Afghanistan, 2 million dead. And counting. Nicaragua, 30,000 to 50,000 dead. El Salvador, 75,000 dead. Guatemala, 200,000 dead.
These aren't statistics.
They're people, farmers, teachers, children. Entire villages wiped out, families destroyed, generations traumatized. And for what?
The Soviet Union collapsed anyway. Not because of proxy wars, but because...
Its economy failed. The Third World victories didn't save Moscow. They just bankrupted it faster.
And America? We won the Cold War?
But lost our moral authority. The atrocities we funded, the dictators we supported, the civilians we killed. These things didn't just disappear when the Berlin Wall fell. The resentment remained, the trauma remained, the instability remained.
Many of today's conflicts, the terrorism, the failed states, the refugee crises, where do they trace their roots?
Directly to the proxy wars we fought in the 1970s and 80s. We armed extremists in Afghanistan. They attacked us on September 11th. We destabilized Central America. Now we wonder why there's a migration crisis. We funded death squads. Now we're surprised when people don't trust American intervention. The Third World proxy wars didn't end when the Cold War ended. They metastasized. They mutated. They came home.
Here's the uncomfortable truth about the secret war.
We tell ourselves we won the Cold War. And on paper we did. The Soviet Union collapsed. Capitalism triumphed. Democracy spread.
But if you zoom in, if you look at the actual battles fought in the jungles, mountains, and cities of the Third World, the picture looks very different, doesn't it?
The Soviets won in Africa. They won in parts of Central America. They built a network of client states that lasted decades. The CIA, meanwhile, funded death squads, armed terrorists, and supported genocides, often to no strategic effect. We spent billions. We killed hundreds of thousands. And we still lost Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Nicaragua. The one war we decisively won. Afghanistan created the conditions for further attacks.
So who really won the Shadow War?
Neither side. The superpowers walked away. The Third World bled.
And here's the lesson we still haven't learned.
You can't win hearts and minds by funding brutality. You can't build democracy by supporting dictators. You can't create stability through coups and death squads. The Soviets learned this the hard way when their empire collapsed. We're still learning it, still repeating the same mistakes in different countries. Still believing that if we just fund the right proxy, arm the right rebel group, support the right strongman, this time it'll work.
And will it?
It won't. Because the Third World Shadow War taught us something our leaders refuse to accept. When you turn someone else's country into your battlefield, don't be surprised when they remember. When you fund violence to prevent revolution, don't be shocked when the revolution wins anyway, just bloodier and angrier.
The Cold War ended.
The proxy wars didn't. They're still burning. In Afghanistan, in Central America, in Africa. Different players, same game, same body count.
We won the Cold War, but what did we lose?
Something more important. The belief that America fights for freedom and democracy. Because in Angola, El Salvador, Guatemala, and a dozen other countries, we didn't fight for freedom. We fought for control.
And we lost?
We lost.
If this deep dive into the CIA's secret failures showed you that the Cold War wasn't the simple good versus evil story you were taught,
then you're starting to see history as it actually happened. Messy, brutal, and morally complicated.
Here at Bellum, we don't do propaganda. We do history. The victories, the defeats, the atrocities, and the lessons we refuse to learn. Hit subscribe for more untold Cold War disasters.
Drop a comment. Do you think the CIA's Third World operations were justified? Or were they strategic and moral failures? And which proxy war do you think had the biggest long-term consequences?
Thanks for watching.
Some wars are won on battlefields.
Others are lost in the shadows.
This was both.